Imagine a fighter jet so radical, so out of this world, that it looked more like something from a science fiction comic than a World War II battlefield. A flying wing with rocket boosters, a prone cockpit where pilots lay flat on their stomachs, and even rear-firing cannons designed to ambush bombers from below. This wasn't a prototype from the future. It was Germany's desperate last gamble, a warplane known as the Gotha P-60. It promised stealth, blistering speed, and firepower that could shred Allied bombers out of the sky. But here's the twist. Despite its mind-bending design, it never left the drawing board. The company's strange past. Before we dive into the P-60 itself, we need to understand the company that dreamed it up, because its story is just as strange as the aircraft it tried to build. The firm was called Gotha Wagenfabrik, and believe it or not, they didn't start by building aeroplanes. Back in 1883, they were making fairground carousels and railway carriages. The idea of flight wasn't even on the horizon yet. But like so many German companies during the First World War, Gotha reinvented itself, shifting from amusement rides and rail cars to building war machines. By the middle of the war, Gotha had carved out a terrifying reputation. Their massive GV bombers became infamous for striking deep into enemy territory, even bombing London in one of history's first long-range air raids. For a moment, Gotha was a name that made entire cities tremble. But that glory didn't last. After the war, the company was sidelined, nearly forgotten, and for over a decade, it faded into obscurity. Then, in the 1930s, as Germany rearmed under the Nazi regime, Gotha resurfaced. They weren't yet designing headline-grabbing aircraft, but they were quietly contributing parts for advanced fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-110 and later the Me-210 and Me-410. These were stepping stones, a way to rebuild their expertise and prove their worth. And while most companies were content with supporting roles, Gotha had bigger ambitions. They weren't just dreaming about helping other firms succeed, they wanted to shock the world with something so bold, so groundbreaking, that it would put their name back at the top of aviation history. That hunger to rise again set the stage for what would become their most audacious gamble, the Gotha P-60. The birth of a desperate project. By the winter of 1944, the skies above Germany were no longer a battlefield. They were a slaughterhouse. Allied bombers flew in massive waves, flattening entire cities day after day. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, was now crumbling. Traditional fighters like the Bf-110 and FW-198 were being ripped apart before they could even climb to altitude. Germany's only hope rested on miracle weapons, machines so advanced, so unconventional that they might turn the tide of war overnight. It was in this atmosphere of desperation that the Reich Air Ministry handed Gotha an almost impossible assignment: design a fighter that could outperform even the Horten Ho-29 flying wing. The man in charge was Dr. Rudolf Gotz, a wind tunnel genius with a reputation for solving aerodynamic puzzles others couldn't. He was given one mission: create a warplane that could push the limits of speed, altitude, and stealth all at once. On January 8, 1945, Gotz's design landed on the ministry's desk like a thunderclap. This wasn't some half-baked sketch. It was a vision for a fighter that aimed to smash through the magic number of 900 kilometers per hour, a speed that put it on the edge of the sound barrier, faster than almost anything in the skies. But speed wasn't enough. Gotz claimed the aircraft's radical flying wing shape would make it nearly invisible to radar. Allied defenses would see nothing but a ghostly blur, a phantom slicing through bomber formations. And then came the cockpit design, one of the strangest concepts ever imagined. Instead of sitting upright, the pilot and radio operator would lay flat, face forward, as if strapped to a rocket sled. It reduced drag, it made the profile smaller, and it promised tighter turns at higher speeds. But it also meant flying this machine would feel more like crawling into a coffin. Not everyone was impressed. The Horten brothers, whose own flying wing design had been stealing headlines, accused Gotha of hijacking their ideas and cutting corners. But Gotha brushed off the accusations, insisting that their project wasn't theory, it was already production ready. And so, while Allied bombers rained destruction across Germany, deep inside Gotha's workshops, pencils scraped and engineers sketched late into the night. The clock was ticking. The P-60 was racing against time, against the Allies, and even against rival German designers. But what Gotha unveiled next would push their already radical design into territory that seemed almost impossible: the first P-60 prototype, known as the P-60A.
The radical P-60A. The first version of this ghostly warplane was the P-60A, and on paper, it looked like something that could rewrite the future of aerial combat. At its core, it was a flying wing with a span of 12.2 meters, sleek, sharp, and futuristic. Unlike traditional fighters with bulky fuselages and tails, the P-60A's design looked like a razor blade slicing through the air. Even more remarkable, much of its structure wasn't made from metal at all, but from wood. That might sound primitive, but this wasn't a step backward, it was a desperate wartime strategy. Germany's metal resources were running dangerously low, so Gotha engineers combined steel with a wooden monocoque framework. It was cheap, lightweight, and strong enough to handle the brutal stresses of high-speed flight. Performance projections were jaw-dropping. The P-60A was expected to hit 915 kilometers per hour at altitude, putting it right on the edge of transonic flight. Its operational ceiling? Around 12,500 meters, far higher than most Allied fighters could dream of reaching. And with a range of nearly 1,600 kilometers, it wasn't just a sprinter, it could patrol the skies or hunt bombers across vast distances. But numbers alone didn't make the P-60A terrifying. It was the weapons. The fighter could be armed with either a pair of 43mm Mk103s, capable of spitting out devastating explosive shells, or two 30mm Mk103s, known for their higher muzzle velocity and long reach. Either choice turned the P-60A into a bomber killer, perfectly suited to rip apart the armored giants that had been flattening German cities. Then there was the cockpit, a feature so radical it deserves its own chapter. The P-60A's motto was chillingly simple: better flat than broken. Instead of sitting upright like every other pilot in history, the crew of two would lie prone, stretched out on padded rests with controls directly in front of their chests. This position shrank the aircraft's profile, slicing drag to a minimum and making the jet faster, harder to hit, and more maneuverable. The trade-off? Extreme discomfort and limited situational awareness. Flying this machine wouldn't just be dangerous, it would be exhausting. The control system was just as advanced. Instead of conventional elevators and ailerons, the P-60A used elevons, combined surfaces that allowed it to roll and pitch without sacrificing stability. To keep the flying wing balanced, it also featured tiny pop-up fins on the wingtips. It was a configuration decades ahead of its time, one that wouldn't become mainstream until modern stealth aircraft. Even the landing gear showed clever thinking. Instead of being crammed into awkward spaces, the wheels retracted cleanly into the center section. The engines, mounted externally, could be swapped out in minutes rather than hours, a life-saving advantage in wartime when downtime often meant death. On paper, the P-60A looked like a fighter pilot's dream and a bomber crew's nightmare. But Gotha wasn't finished. As daring as the A model was, it was only the starting point. Engineers quickly began sketching out even more extreme versions, each one stranger, more ambitious, and more dangerous than the last. And that's where the story of the P-60 takes a wild turn, as rocket boosters, radar arrays, and flying fortress firepower enter the picture. Supercharged variants. The P-60A might have been daring, but Gotha didn't stop there. In a last-ditch race against time and destruction, they began sketching out a family of P-60 fighters, each one with its own shocking twist. The first was the P-60R, the rocket-assisted interceptor. Imagine the already blistering P-60A, but with a Valter high-work rocket booster strapped on. This engine could pour out nearly 2 tons of thrust for short bursts, giving the aircraft a vertical climb rate that no Allied fighter could match. In theory, it could blast skyward in seconds, piercing bomber formations before anyone even knew it was there. At extreme altitudes, where conventional fighters looked like tiny dots on the horizon, the P-60R would swoop in like a predator from another world. But Gotha wanted more than altitude and speed. They wanted firepower. That ambition produced the P-60B, a heavyweight variant that looked less like a fighter and more like a flying fortress. Gone was the cramped prone cockpit. In its place, an upright tandem layout gave both crew members full visibility in combat. Beneath its wings roared 2 Heinkel HES-011 jet engines, each pumping out 13 kilonewtons of thrust. And if that wasn't enough, engineers added an optional rocket booster for sudden bursts of raw power. The result? A jet with a takeoff weight close to 14,000 kilograms, massive for a fighter, but still agile thanks to its swept wings and advanced control surfaces. Armed with either 2 43mm Mk108s or 4 Mk213C autocannons, the P-60B wasn't just a bomber interceptor, it was an airborne artillery piece. A squadron of these could have turned Allied bombing runs into flaming wreckage. Then came the P-60C, the most radical of them all. This version was designed as a night fighter, stretching the fuselage by 2 full meters to fit a 3-man crew. Up front sat the pilot, Behind him, two radar operators manned the cutting-edge Fug 244 Berlin radar system, its nose bristling with antennas like a metallic hedgehog. With this setup, the P-60C could hunt targets in the dead of night or through heavy cloud cover, a terrifying thought for Allied bomber crews who had long relied on the darkness for safety. But the most shocking feature wasn't the radar. Hidden in the fuselage were two upward-angled Mk-10 cannons set at a 20-degree tilt. This was the infamous Schrag music tactic, guns firing straight into the bellies of bombers from below where they were most vulnerable. Allied crews, sitting blind in the night sky, would never even see the attack coming. To handle long-range patrols, the P-60C carried 3,500 liters of fuel, allowing it to stay airborne for hours. But this endurance came with a price. 3 men packed into a cramped cockpit, sharing the same recycled air, rattling through every vibration of the jet. It was a machine that demanded absolute trust and coordination from its crew, because in combat, every second meant life or death. Each variant pushed the P-60 further into the realm of the impossible. The A model was sleek, the R was rocket-propelled, the B was a heavy-hitting fortress, and the C was a silent predator of the night. All of them were radical, futuristic, and terrifying. But there was one thing they all had in common. Not a single one ever flew. Because while Gotha's engineers dreamed bigger and bigger, reality was closing in fast. And when it hit like a storm of fire. The brutal reality. For all its radical designs and futuristic promise, the Gotha P-60 never had a chance to leave the drafting board. Because while engineers were sketching out variants that looked like something decades ahead of their time, the real world was burning down around them. On February 24, 1944, more than 160 American B-24 bombers thundered toward Gotha's main factory. Their target wasn't just another industrial site. It was Gotha's beating heart, the only place capable of producing the P-60. In less than an hour, the sky rained down nearly 456 tons of explosives. The destruction was apocalyptic. 80% of the facility was wiped out, entire production halls flattened, and over 230 workers killed instantly. The loss was catastrophic, but worse was still to come. In July of the same year, another raid swept in, obliterating what little remained and claiming even more lives. The few workshops that survived were forced underground, hidden away in caves and tunnels as Allied bombers prowled above. By early 1945, Gotha was fighting for survival. Engineers who should have been perfecting prototypes were instead scrounging for parts, moving equipment from one bombed-out site to another, or simply trying to stay alive. Every attempt to rebuild was crushed by another wave of Allied bombers. Meanwhile, resources were drying up. Fuel, steel, even skilled workers, all were vanishing. Germany's war economy was collapsing, and priorities shifted to producing spare parts for existing fighters like the Bf-110. Projects as ambitious as the P-60 were reduced to nothing more than stacks of unfinished blueprints. And so, while the Allies closed in on Berlin, the Gotha P-60 never even reached the prototype stage. No engines ever roared to life. No test pilot ever felt the prone cockpit's strange embrace. No bomber crew ever looked out their window to see a winged phantom streaking toward them. Instead, the P-60 became a ghost, a legend that never flew. But even in death, the story wasn't over, because in the ruins of Germany, whispers began to circulate about what might have happened if Gotha had succeeded. And those what-ifs would fuel decades of speculation. Legacy and what if. The Gotha P-60 never left the drawing board, but somehow it still refuses to die. Aviation historians, model builders, and war buffs keep coming back to it, not because it fought in the skies, but because of what it might have been. Think about its features. A flying wing design with minimal radar visibility? That's stealth, decades before stealth became a buzzword. A prone cockpit to reduce drag? Odd, uncomfortable, maybe even impractical, but the thinking behind it was pure innovation. A rear-firing cannon system for ambush attacks? That's the kind of asymmetrical thinking modern air forces now celebrate. In so many ways, the P-60 wasn't just a weapon of its time, it was a prototype for the future. And that's what makes its story so fascinating. Some experts argue that if Gotha had just 6 more months, maybe even less, the P-60 could have made it to prototype stage. If it had flown, it might have been faster, higher, and deadlier than anything the Allies had. Imagine bomber formations torn apart by a ghostly jet they couldn't see on radar. Imagine night raids suddenly becoming death traps as upward-firing cannons ripped into bombers from below. But then again, there's the other side of the story. Could it really have changed the war? Even if the P-60 had flown, Germany was already collapsing from within. Factories were rubble, fuel was vanishing, and pilots were in short supply. A miracle machine on paper doesn't win wars when there's nothing left to keep it flying. The truth is the P-60 might have been too little, too late. And yet that's exactly why it still captures imaginations today. The P-60 is a ghost plane, a legend of what might have been, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous machines of war are the ones that never make it into the sky. So let me ask you, which part of this phantom jet shocked you the most? Was it the coffin-like prone cockpit, the rocket-boosted climb, or those deadly upward-firing cannons? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to see what you think. And if you enjoyed this dive into aviation's strangest what-ifs, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and tap the bell, because we've got plenty more forgotten war machines and unbelievable designs coming your way. You won't want to miss the next one.